Hi, I'm Megan and I'm one of the High Rock pastors. Wherever you find yourself tuning in from, know that it is a privilege to be with you. While I miss seeing many of your faces on Sunday morning, I found that there are wonderful things about having Sunday mornings from home, too. I know my sons miss Kids Rock, but they really love dancing and singing with mom and dad. We love talking together and taking communion together too. And I don't know if it's okay to admit this, but man, as a pastor, I love running before church. And I don't even have to shower after. Hope and no soap, am I right? I grew up running because my dad was a runner, and he sort of raised me to be a purist. There was no music allowed. You had to pay attention to your breath and the tread of your feet on the pavement. That was easy when this was my option, but after I tore my ACL freshman year of college and started to run again, I got an iPod to listen to music. Mostly because I was so frustrated with how hard it was now. But then I'd get a certain song on my playlist, probably by Beyonce, and I felt bad. And not bad like awful, but bad like Michael Jackson bad. I could run forever because I was a boss. Have you ever experienced a high like that where you knew you were crushing your goals and were at the top of your game? You were the boss. People could give you input, sure, but at the end of the day, it was going to go your way. That's the best. I mean, it's certainly at the heart of the American dream. In fact, 85% of people in the workforce believe that that's true. Books and podcasts that are geared towards helping people gain independence in their work and life comprise a multi-billion-dollar industry. We're promised that this boss life will help us be our true selves, where we'll be happy and successful and answer to no one but us. It's why we look up to Oprah and Sheryl Sandberg and Michael Jordan. These are people who worked hard, who were the best in the world. They are bosses. Also, is anyone else so glad for The Last Dance right now? I miss sports. Maybe you can resonate with that, but maybe you can't at all. Maybe you've spent your life with other people controlling you. Kids, I really struggled with my parents telling me what to do, and I think my parents probably struggled with me in that too. Sorry, Mom. I mean, it's not always a terrible situation. I've had really wonderful bosses, but sometimes they can be harmful. When a person who has authority abuses that power at the expense of another, the desire for autonomy is actually liberation. In some ways, if we aren't aware of it, we can be caught in a continuous struggle for control. Kids, it's sort of like fighting for the remote with your siblings, or who gets to be the one who decides what you'll play that day. Watching Spider-Man or Star Wars, playing Uno or Mousetrap. In our house, there's constant bargaining going on about whose turn it is to pick. One of my sons might enjoy having that power more than the other. Our sermon series has had us exploring what the Apostle Paul may have learned in prison that he conveyed to the church in Philippi. At the heart of our time together today, I'd like you to consider the possibility that one of those things is the notion of what it means to be a boss and how it could reorient our posture and practice in the world. We're going to take a break now and dig into a couple of questions, either in your homes or on the chat. All right, welcome back. I wonder what sort of feelings this brought up for you. Perhaps a sense of accomplishment or joy when you remembered a good time. Perhaps a feeling of frustration or a drive to work harder to get to your goal. I personally felt both of those things. There are places in my life where I'm so grateful for good leadership that has guided me. And there are other places, though, where unhealthy leadership has felt stifling and I feel like I can't breathe. I feel like I'm the whole of the problem when I'm not. Interestingly enough, by the time we get to Paul in Philippians, he's experienced every range of these feelings. He's been an unhealthy leader that has killed those who won't fall in line. And he's been a healthy leader that has helped facilitate the growth of the church. He's gained favor with institutional powers and he's lost it. And when we encounter him here, he's been imprisoned. By all accounts, Paul has been a boss. And now he's one of the forgotten ones in society. He's got no power, no position, no rights. It might be how you feel in this time. It might be how you felt even pre-COVID. And yet Paul is the one encouraging the church towards a different way of being in the world, even in this state. What happened to him? What changed? Could we learn a different way of being too? In Acts 9, we read about Paul's first encounter with the resurrected Christ. He had written permission to persecute Christians. He believed that he was protecting the integrity of the faith in which he had been raised. He believed he knew what was best, and he didn't hesitate to use his power to force others to live that way too. But at the end of the day, Paul's power was good only for Paul. I can resonate with how easy it is to do that, to use whatever power and influence I have just for me and for those I love. I mean, yes, life is harder for us than normal right now, but my family still has a very steady income and our kids are healthy. I recognize that that's not the reality for many others. My husband and I aren't in professions where we're being forced to choose about going into the office or losing our income. My son is disabled and immunocompromised, but we can stay isolated as long as we need to keep him safe. Meanwhile, people in the disabled and elderly community have been trying to tell us for so many years how hard it is to be isolated from the world that isn't built for them. And as a whole, our church has been privileged enough to sort of set some of those exclamations aside. Because the system still works for us. That is, until we all felt the effects of isolation. We can't set it aside anymore. If my life is just for me, I can hear the cries over the murder of Ahmaud Arbery or Sandra Bland or Eric Garner and feel saddened, but I can set it aside. The disproportionate morbidity rates of Black and brown people in the United States from COVID-19 can stare at me glaringly, and I can still choose to set them aside. Unless something makes me shift so that I no longer just see them as numbers and can't set them aside, because I can no longer set people aside. Something made Paul shift like this. He encountered the resurrected Christ and his world changed. The way that Paul thought about power and agency and what his rights were was upended, and he could no longer set people aside. The text tells us that he was made blind, but that in that state he was more aware than ever of his connection to Christ. He realized that Jesus was the source of the faith he was trying to protect. Jesus was not in the way, he was the way that things could be restored. The way that things could be restored the way the psalmists of his faith had proclaimed. Right before our text for the morning, Paul clarified what life means for people that have recognized what Jesus did in being the way. Jesus came to end the racial, social, gender, and cultural prejudice that had divided them in the first place. These people are no longer to operate independently of each other, but to share in one spirit, the Spirit of Christ. They are no longer to operate independently of each other, but to share in one spirit, the Spirit of Christ. They cannot just operate for themselves out of vanity or conceit, but out of humility. Humility is this concept that sounds really good on paper, but it's so hard to put into practice. It certainly isn't what one thinks of when they imagine being a boss, and yet here we have a leader of a religious movement who had a visceral encounter with Jesus, writing from jail. encouraging God's people to a life of humility. And it shouldn't have been foreign to Paul. After all, the Old Testament is full of texts that were meant to shape a community identity around having humility and sacrificing for one another. And it was because their community was oriented around remembering God. They read the scriptures to remember who God was together. And what came out of that were their stories that talked about God as a creator who invited people into an interconnected relationship with all of creation. There were stories about God as Redeemer who liberates all of creation. This creation and redemption was out of love, and the community was invited to remember this together. Paul knew these stories, just like many of us know these stories. But like many of us, Paul put himself at the center of the stories instead of God. We're going to take another break now, and I'll ask you to consider a few questions for discussion. Welcome back. I hope that those simple questions helped wake up some place in your memory that helps you become more aware of Christ. When Paul had his encounter with Christ, it changed everything, and he realized that in Jesus, God's love took on a profound form. The God of the universe took on flesh, ate, laughed, cried, loved, suffered, and died because God loved. And love cannot be contained. It is generous and it overflows and it pours out. And so this God of love was poured out into the creation that God loved. God chose a path of humility because God has always been in solidarity with us, and this form shows it most of all. Jesus felt the full weight of the hurt and suffering we endure, and not to shame us or to guilt us, but because God has always loved us more than we could fully imagine. As he was sitting in prison, whatever losses Paul has already experienced must have been magnified. Whatever is hard outside of prison is exacerbated within it. Whatever cracks have existed in our relationships, in our work, in our addictions, and in our spiritual life, well, they can feel like chasms now. Right now, some of you might feel a little imprisoned by this pandemic, and you're starting to see the cracks in your world. But most of us can only begin to imagine what it must be like in an actual prison. Prisons in the United States have been hit harder by COVID-19 than almost any other segment of the population, with cases more than doubling every week, and estimates predicting that at least 99% of all incarcerated people will contract the virus. The prisons you imagine when you think of your life now might be literal or figurative, but they are real, and so were Paul's. He went from being the boss to being a nobody. It would have been so easy to be angry, but his encounter with Christ changed him. What was magnified for Paul in prison was not his own anger, but the reality of Christ's love, and it humbled him. And so he charges the church with a call to choose humility too. And church, that invitation is for us as well. A boss might experience this physical distance as a loss of control. In a bid to regain a feeling of control, a boss might choose to lash out in anger at their housemates. They might choose to self-medicate to stop feeling anything at all. They might choose to pocket away resources that they would have given away before the pandemic. To break free of this, we have to take the posture of Christ, who became that which God loved, and loved with his life. Paul reminds his people of this through a song, and it was an early hymn of the church, maybe one that they sang together in their church services. It reminded them of Christ and created a community identity. It reminded them of their dependence on divine love and on one another. The late Rachel Held Evans called it a new unifying battle cry. We are one in Christ, who in all humility and manner of suffering creates a new reality. What rhythms do you have that remind you of God's invitation to love? What helps remind you that you don't have to be the boss who makes everything work? We have a unique opportunity in this time to set new rhythms, because prison takes a lot of things, but one of the things that it gives you is time. Paul had lots of time to pray. If this hasn't been part of your rhythm, it might be the time to start. I personally have loved the practice of praying without ceasing. The act of engaging in praying without ceasing creates a shift in me that changes my attitude towards others and the world. The theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher describes it as the constant remembrance, the sense of, and trust of the divine in relation to all matters of importance in life. It's present in our day-to-day activities. Praying without ceasing can happen while delighting in creation, while talking about work, enjoying company, appreciating the gifts that God has given you, walking, working, loving, and contemplating. We might not have an encounter like Paul's on the road to Damascus, but we can still encounter Christ and be changed. When I recognize the presence of God in all of creation and in every person, I can give thanks to God. I can recognize God present in my suffering. If you've not practiced this before, I'd suggest starting with just carving out time for silence. Our prototypical boss doesn't like to wait. They expect others to respect their time. When we come to God in silence, we're implicitly recognizing that we are not the boss by giving God our time and attention and not just a to-do list. In this silence, be present to where you notice the stirring of love in your life. Can you give thanks to God for those gifts? Try to just be present to where you can feel pain or discomfort. Can you give thanks to God that Christ is in solidarity with you in those places too? Try being present to where you have questions. Can you give thanks that God does not grow weary of our questions, but even in holding all of those things, invites them? When we can notice God in all things and see God moving in restoring all things, we can join in the work of worshiping God, We can let go of the things that aren't ours to control. And spoiler alert, that's like everything. Instead, we can hold on to our task of worship. Our worship is this: to act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with our God. In our worship, we can be free to love. We move out of our individual selves and into unity with one another. My prayer practices start in silence so that I can pay attention to what God is telling me through my feelings. I ask questions around them. This week, they've looked like this. God, is this anger rising in me because I'm deflecting blame for the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Douglas Lewis? Or is it because it's anger that you share at that injustice? Once I name that, I'm moved to face how my whiteness allows me to perpetuate a racist narrative that would make it okay that these two men going about their business would be killed. I confessed what God brought to me. It puts me in a posture of humility with God, and then I can respond out of that place, using whatever position God has given me to name this, to name my sin and God's love. I hear the call to remember who God is, this God who is doing new things and makes a way out of nothing. I see it in the moments of laughter with my kids and friends. I see it in the sunshine and in the stories of how you all are worshiping God in mercy and humility. The act of prayer can move us to action where we remember God's heart and love. Worshiping in mercy and humility might be a simple act of talking to someone you notice who doesn't have friends at a party or on the playground. It might be writing a note to someone who's isolated, alone. It could be choosing financial sacrifice so that someone else can pay their rent or buy food. It could be realizing that your social or church circles are made up of people that are also in your same racial group, tax bracket, or political party, and choosing to pour love into someone who is different from you. Church, I've seen all of this from you during this pandemic, and it is beautiful. If you've been on the receiving end of one of these acts, you know that it changes you. There is an embodiment of the love that is Christ's in these acts, and our encounters with Christ's love changes us. Friends, living a life of humility is not an act of submission to people that might take advantage of us. It's not me asking you to be passive or weak. It's an act of submitting to love. It can still encompass a whole lot of boss moves, but it's with an entirely different motivation. We can act justly by listening to voices on the margins, the disabled people who have been living in isolation far before us. What can we learn from them about how to meet God in this time? We can love mercy through partnering in relief efforts for those crushed by this pandemic, just like you'll hear about later on Hope and Soap. We walk humbly in our relationships, trying to extend extra grace and love to others and to ourselves, because that is what God does for us all. It provides true liberation for everyone, for the people that the world affirms and the ones it does not. A life of prayer helps ground us in the reality that God is God and we are not, as my dear colleagues Doug and Adele remind me constantly. We can come to encounters with Christ to remember God's will, and it drives us to action in unity with Christ. The shift in seeing our interdependence and unity as a divine appointment opens our perspective on how we can love others more. In praying and living and caring for others like Jesus did, our lives become beacons of hope and testimonies to the resurrecting work of Christ our Lord. To God be the glory forever and ever. Amen.